Frost gripped the rusted ironwork of the Brightside Steel Foundry on the morning the first anomaly was discovered. The massive facility had sat derelict since a bitter union dispute shut off the furnaces, leaving the surrounding terrace streets under a permanent pall of industrial rot. A skeleton crew of structural surveyors tasked with assessing the main clock tower for demolition forced the heavy timber doors open at 7:30. Inside the cavernous, grease-coated machinery hall, the air tasted of stagnant damp and oxidized copper. The clock had not ticked in 11 months. Yet the massive counterweights hanging in the central shaft had been deliberately repositioned. The surveyors directed their heavy-duty torches upward into the gloom of the pulley system. Suspended from a braided steel cable, 20 feet above the concrete floor, was the body of a man. He was not dangling by the neck. He had been meticulously integrated into the mechanics. Thick leather industrial strapping bound his torso tightly to the primary lead weight. His presence in the shaft was calculated to provide the exact gravitational mass required to bypass the seized gears. It was a cold engineering solution, executed with absolute precision. Before I begin this story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. This story is incredibly interesting, so I advise you not to miss any important details. The deceased was identified 48 hours later through dental records and a tarnished brass union badge found in his heavy wool coat. Thomas Rutter, aged 41, a former shift foreman who had been highly vocal during the wildcat strikes that crippled the local foundries. The initial post-mortem report, typed up in triplicate at the local constabulary, noted the complete absence of defensive wounds or signs of a physical struggle. South Yorkshire police initially suspected a grim industrial suicide, the kind often seen in men laid off from the heavy works. However, the pathology results painted a vastly different, highly technical picture. The Home Office pathologist found a single puncture wound at the base of Rutter's skull, just above the first cervical vertebra. The entry point was a perfectly circular hole, measuring precisely 6 millimeters in diameter. There was no exit wound. A localized cerebral hemorrhage had caused near instantaneous brain death. The surrounding tissue showed 0 powder burns, ruling out a conventional firearm. Instead, the margins of the wound were lined with trace amounts of synthetic pneumatic grease. The mechanism of death was undeniable. A hardened steel bolt had been driven directly into the brainstem using compressed air, then immediately retracted. The methodology left no blood spatter on the surrounding ironwork. The execution was entirely frictionless. This was not the work of a typical street thug with a switchblade or a heavy wrench. The officers assigned to the initial cordon, a mix of jaded uniform constables freezing in their heavy tunics, secured the area with a profound lack of urgency, unaware they were standing in a curated mechanical exhibition. Crime scene photographs from the era, captured on high-contrast black and white film, show a bleak, utilitarian space where human life had been treated as nothing more than a faulty component. The investigating detectives logged the details on standardized incident boards, noting the disturbing lack of standard criminal motives. There was no robbery. Rutter's wallet containing 30 quid in cash remained untouched. There were no signs of a sexual assault. There was only the clinical extraction of a man from the local population, repurposed to balance a set of gears. Sheffield in 1974 was a city built on smoke and noise, suddenly forced into periods of quiet by rolling power cuts and a collapsing economy. The pubs along Attercliffe Road were filled with redundant steelworkers nursing warm pints, their conversations laced with resentment toward management and union bosses alike. Rutter was well known in these establishments. He was a man who agitated for walkouts, someone who actively jammed the industrial wheel. His death barely registered beyond his immediate family and a handful of drinking companions down at the local. The regional press, distracted by broader economic crises, ran a minor column on page 4 of the evening paper, citing a sudden death in an empty mill. At police headquarters, the physical file for Thomas Rutter joined a growing stack of unsolved anomalies. The old bill, heavily reliant on a network of public house informants and street-level grasses, found absolutely nothing of value. The local criminal fraternity was entirely ignorant of the method or the motive. The word on the damp, soot-stained streets was simply that Rutter had crossed the wrong individual over borrowed dosh or a bad bet, but the truth was far less conventional. The killer had not acted out of anger, revenge, or financial gain. To the perpetrator, Thomas Rutter was merely an obstruction, an element of friction that had been identified, isolated, and permanently removed from the machine. There were no leads, no suspects, and no forensics capable of pointing toward the damp terrace house where Alistair Vance Glowax was already recalibrating his pneumatic tools for the next necessary extraction. Number 42 Carbrook Street was identical to the 70 other soot-blackened brick terraces in the row, distinguishable only by the heavy blackout curtains drawn permanently across the parlor window. Inside, the damp air smelled faintly of cutting oil and boiled cabbage. This was the residence of Alistair Vance Glowax. To the few neighbors who observed his routine, he was merely a quiet bachelor who left at dawn, clutching a tin lunchbox, and returned as the street lamps flickered to life. He did not frequent betting shops or drink bitter in the corner pub. His isolation was total, cultivated out of contempt for the unpredictable noise of human interaction. He required absolute order. The external world, with its strikes and economic decay, offered only chaos. Born in 1938 to a displaced Polish combat engineer and a stern Scottish textile weaver, Vance Glowax inherited a dual legacy of rigid discipline and mechanical aptitude. Apprenticed at 16 as a precision machinist, he later specialized in horology, the science of timekeeping devices. For over a decade, he maintained complex timepieces and industrial pressure gauges for a prominent Sheffield firm. He possessed an intrinsic understanding of tight tolerances. He knew that a gear misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter could tear a heavy motor apart. To Vance Glowax, a machine was the purest expression of purpose. It did not complain about working hours, it did not embezzle funds, and it did not sabotage its own function. It merely required correct calibration. By the early 1970s, the industrial landscape of South Yorkshire was fracturing. Factories closed, assembly lines ground to a halt, and the streets filled with disenfranchised laborers. Vance Glowax viewed this societal collapse not through a political or empathetic lens, but as a catastrophic mechanical failure. Society was, in his rigidly structured mind, simply a macroscopic engine. When trains were delayed by hungover signalmen, or production was halted by union agitators stealing copper wire from the yards, he did not see human fallibility. He saw systemic friction. In engineering, friction is the ultimate enemy. It generates destructive heat, degrades moving parts, and causes total system seizure. The logical response to friction is lubrication or permanent removal. There was no singular traumatic event in his childhood, no abusive patriarch or religious zealotry to fit the neat profiles favored by modern psychiatric literature. Vance Glowax was not driven by sexual sadism or a thirst for power. His pathology was entirely utilitarian. He spent his evenings in the damp cellar of his terrace, working under the harsh glare of a single utility bulb, surrounded by metal lathes and micrometers. It was here he began modifying standard industrial tools for a new, highly specific application. He bypassed safety regulators on a high-pressure pneumatic rivet gun, milling bespoke steel bolts that could penetrate bone and retract in a fraction of a second. He tested the device on pork carcasses from a local butcher, measuring the atmospheric pressure. His meticulous preparations mirrored his work on clock faces. He catalogued observations of the local populace in a heavy ledger. He attended public meetings, stood quietly at the back of crowded railway stations, and watched. He identified the loudest agitators, the persistently negligent, the minor thieves disrupting the local economy. These individuals were catalogued as defective units, He calculated their routines, mapping their movements with geometric precision. Vance Glowacz did not hate the people he recorded. Hate was an inefficient emotion. He saw the grand engine of Sheffield tearing itself apart, possessing the skills to extract the grit from the gears. Rudder's death was merely a successful proof of concept. The machine required extensive maintenance, and the horologist had only just begun his shift. Rail freight logistics in the winter of 1973 operated on a precipice of human error and failing infrastructure. The Tinsley Marshalling Yard, a sprawling labyrinth of oxidized iron and coal dust, managed the bulk of South Yorkshire's heavy transit. It was an environment governed by strict schedules, massive tonnage, and the questionable reliability of the men operating the manual levers. Arthur Pendleton was one of these men. Employed as a senior signalman, Pendleton possessed a 20-year tenure that was heavily masked by a deepening, untreated reliance on cheap scotch and warm bitter. His colleagues in the local rail union consistently covered for his frequent absences and late shifts, adhering to a stubborn working-class code of silence that prioritized solidarity over operational safety. This institutional tolerance of negligence was precisely the kind of systemic friction that Alistair Vance Glowacz had begun to document in his meticulous leather-bound ledger. The catalyst for the horologist's intervention occurred in late October. Pendleton, operating the Eastern Junction box after consuming 4 pints at his local, misaligned a critical track switch. The resulting collision derailed 6 heavy wagons carrying specialized steel coils. The destruction of the cargo directly precipitated the bankruptcy of a secondary engineering firm in Rotherham, putting 40 men out of work and severely disrupting the supply chain of custom brass fittings that Vance Glowacz relied upon for his precision repairs. The regional press framed the incident as a tragic mechanical failure, and the union successfully protected Pendleton from dismissal. The signalman received nothing more than a temporary suspension with partial pay. To the horologist, watching quietly from the periphery, this outcome was a catastrophic failure of the societal regulatory mechanism. The faulty component had not been removed. It had been actively protected. Vance Glowacz did not experience anger at the derailment. He experienced the cold intellectual frustration of an engineer watching a grand machine tear itself apart. He designated Pendleton as his primary test subject. For 3 weeks, the machinist tracked the signalman's movements. Pendleton's routine was highly predictable, defined entirely by his shift patterns and his patronization of the Black Swan, a dark public house adjacent to the rail yards. Vance Glowacz noted the ambient lighting conditions, the average foot traffic on the damp, cobbled access roads, and the exact window of isolation when Pendleton walked from the pub to his terraced housing estate. In the basement of Carbrook Street, the modified pneumatic rivet gun was cleaned, oiled, and loaded with a bespoke, milled steel bolt. The pressure canister, normally attached to heavy factory lines, was adapted into a portable, high-pressure harness worn discreetly beneath a heavy trench coat. On the 12th of November, a dense, freezing fog rolled off the River Don, severely reducing visibility across the industrial corridor. Pendleton left the pub at 11:15, stumbling slightly as he navigated the unlit path bordering the eastern perimeter fence of the marshalling yard. The ambient grinding noise of shunting engines masked any approaching footsteps. Vance Glowacz intercepted the signalman in a narrow brick underpass beneath the main rail bridge. The encounter lasted less than 4 seconds. There was no dialogue, no theatrical declaration of vengeance, and absolutely no struggle. Stepping directly behind the intoxicated man, Vance Glowacz pressed the heavy steel muzzle of the pneumatic tool against the base of Pendleton's neck and engaged the air release valve. The compressed blast drove the steel bolt directly into the cervical spine and retracted it instantly. Pendleton collapsed onto the damp concrete without making a sound, his central nervous system entirely short-circuited. The execution generated a brief, sharp hiss of escaping air, instantly swallowed by the distant screech of a braking freight train. Vance Glowacz did not check the victim's pockets or linger to observe the body. He simply adjusted his coat over the pneumatic harness and continued walking at a measured, unhurried pace toward the residential grid. When a passing railway worker discovered the body at dawn, the initial assumption by the attending constable was a sudden cardiac arrest brought on by cold weather and heavy drinking. The tiny, bloodless puncture wound, hidden beneath the thick collar of Pendleton's woolen coat, was entirely overlooked during the preliminary examination. The death was recorded as natural causes, leaving no case file for the old Bill to investigate. The first correction had been applied, and the system, in Vance Glowac's mind, ran marginally smoother. Municipal corruption in the mid-70s did not manifest in grand conspiracies. It was a petty administrative rot, executed in damp council offices over lukewarm tea. Leonard Baines was a prime facilitator of this decay. Employed as a senior surveyor for the city council, Baines supplemented his stagnant government salary by accepting quiet envelopes of cash from aggressive private developers. In exchange, he stamped demolition orders on perfectly sound Victorian terraces, forcing working-class families into cheaply poured concrete high-rises that were already breeding black mold. To the displaced residents, it was a bureaucratic tragedy. To Alistair Vance Glowac, tracking the urban displacement through public records, Baines was a structural parasite actively weakening the foundational integrity of the city. He was a faulty component that required immediate extraction before the surrounding architecture collapsed. The extraction of Leonard Baines took place in late October 1976. Baines worked late on Tuesdays, processing fraudulent paperwork in the bleak municipal annex off West Street. At 8 o'clock, he walked the 3 blocks to his parked Rover P6. The autumn evening was entirely typical for Sheffield, a steady, freezing drizzle cutting through the sodium-orange glow of the street lamps. Vance Glowac did not rush. Wearing a heavy waxed jacket to conceal the bulk of the high-pressure canister, the horologist intercepted Baines as the clerk fumbled with his car keys. The sequence was identical to the Pendleton extraction. A single step into the man's blind spot, the firm placement of the modified pneumatic muzzle against the lower cranium, and the immediate depression of the air valve. The steel bolt deployed and retracted. Baines slumped against the driver's side door, dead before his knees hit the wet tarmac. A passing patrol car found him 2 hours later. Because Baines was a civil servant, the post-mortem was thorough enough to locate the 6mm puncture wound, elevating the incident from a sudden collapse to an unexplained homicide. 2 years passed before the machinery required further maintenance. By November 1978, the economic landscape had worsened significantly, and betting shops had become the primary drain for whatever spare dosh the remaining foundry workers possessed. Colin Travers managed a smoky linoleum-floored Bookmakers on Addercliff Road. Travers had developed a sophisticated, entirely illegal system of delaying the stamping of betting slips, skimming a percentage of the winnings before handing the reduced payouts to his largely mathematically illiterate clientele. It was a minor, localized theft, but it generated an artificial poverty that Vance Glowac found incredibly inefficient. He observed Travers for a full month, noting the exact time the clerk locked the shop's reinforced steel shutters. Travers was removed on a Tuesday night. The narrow alley behind the Bookmakers smelled strongly of stale urine and rotting newsprint. As Travers pulled the heavy iron grate down, the pneumatic tool was discharged directly into his brainstem. The clerk's body was left neatly propped against the corrugated iron of the back exit. His pockets, containing over 200 quid in skimmed cash, were completely ignored. By the end of 1978, the old Bill were sitting on 2 separate murders displaying highly unusual identical pathology. Yet the investigating officers struggled to find a cohesive narrative. The victims were completely disconnected by class, geography, and social circles. A corrupt council surveyor and a thieving betting shop clerk shared zero overlap in the pub networks or criminal ledgers of South Yorkshire. Furthermore, the complete absence of robbery, sexual assault, or defensive violence baffled the detectives. Standard police procedure relied heavily on identifying impulsive human motives. jealousy, debt, or territorial gang disputes. Vance Glowitz provided none of these. He operated with the cold detachment of a maintenance engineer, executing scheduled repairs. The police files swelled with typed witness statements and useless informant tips, while the killer simply returned to his cellar on Carbrook Street, quietly updating his heavy leather ledger and awaiting the next necessary calibration. In the rigorous discipline of mechanical engineering, there is a principle known as metal fatigue. Repeated cyclical loading, even when operating well within nominal stress parameters, will eventually cause microscopic structural fractures to propagate through a material. Alistair Vance Glowitz understood this principle perfectly when it applied to the brass gears of a pocket watch or the drive shafts of a heavy lathe. However, he fundamentally failed to account for the fatigue developing within his own bespoke pneumatic device. The execution harness had been utilized successfully 4 times, discharging highly pressurized air to drive a heavy steel bolt. He had regularly oiled the mechanisms, but he had not X-rayed the primary firing pin. The variable that finally introduced catastrophic friction into the horologist's perfect system was a man named Terence "the Pike" Rollins. Rollins was a mid-level loan shark operating out of the brutalist concrete sprawl of the Park Hill estate. Unlike the previous targets, whose routines were dictated by shift work or bureaucratic office hours, Rollins was a creature of erratic, chemical-fueled impulse. He consumed heavy amounts of illicit amphetamines, making his movements twitchy, unpredictable, and entirely devoid of geometric logic. To Vance Glowitz, Rollins was a chaotic gear shredding the teeth of the local economy, extorting desperate steelworkers and driving them into destitution. The extraction was scheduled for a bleak Friday evening in early February 1979. Vance Glowitz tracked Rollins to a dimly lit walkway on the 4th tier of the estate. The damp concrete amplified the sound of the howling winter wind. The horologist stepped from the shadows of a stairwell, moving to execute the standard procedure. A silent approach from the blind spot, the firm placement of the muzzle against the brainstem, and the immediate release of the compressed air. But Rollins, wired on stimulants, turned sharply at the exact millisecond the air valve was depressed. The lateral movement completely altered the trajectory of the bolt. Instead of entering cleanly through the cervical gap, the hardened steel slammed into the thickest part of Rollins' occipital bone at a severe angle. The pneumatic force was still immense. The bolt penetrated the skull, causing fatal, instantaneous brain trauma. Rollins collapsed instantly. However, the extreme shear force of the angled impact, combined with the microscopic metal fatigue accumulated over the previous executions, caused the tip of the bespoke bolt to fracture. A jagged 4mm shard of high-carbon tungsten alloy snapped off and remained lodged deep within the loan shark's cranium. The retracting mechanism hissed violently, jamming halfway. For the first time, Vance Glowitz had to physically wrench his tool free before retreating into the freezing night. 72 hours later, the local CID finally possessed the physical evidence they desperately needed. Detective Inspector Harold Miller, a heavy-smoking veteran of the Sheffield Constabulary who had grown deeply frustrated by the string of bloodless, motive-free murders, received a priority call from the Home Office pathology lab. The extraction of the metal shard fundamentally shifted the investigation from a blind hunt into a highly specific technical inquiry. The forensic metallurgist at the University of Sheffield provided Inspector Miller with a devastatingly precise breakdown of the anomaly. Material composition. The shard was not standard commercial steel. It was a highly specialized tungsten-carbide alloy, typically reserved for cutting tools that require extreme durability under heat. Machining signature. Under extreme magnification, the shard displayed microstriations that indicated it had been milled on a manual, high-precision lathe, not mass-produced in a factory. It was a bespoke, custom-engineered component. Chemical residue. The most damning evidence was microscopic traces of a highly refined synthetic lubricant found near the fracture line. It was an anti-friction oil used almost exclusively in horology and high-end gauge calibration. The connection was finally established. The police were not looking for a gang enforcer, a jealous lover, or an aggrieved union boss. They were looking for a master machinist, a man who possessed a private lathe, access to specialized alloys, and an intimate working knowledge of horological lubrication. Inspector Miller immediately dispatched a team of junior detectives to cross-reference municipal tax records with local trade registries. The parameter was terrifyingly narrow. Within 48 hours, the CID had compiled a definitive list of just 7 independent precision engineers and clock repairmen residing within a 3-mile radius of the murders. Alistair Vance Glowich, seated in his damp cellar on Carbrook Street, was entirely unaware of the administrative net closing around him. He was seated at his heavy workbench beneath the harsh utility bulb, meticulously disassembling the jammed pneumatic cylinder, trying to identify the exact point of structural failure so he could recalibrate the machine. The Home Office pathology report on Terence the Pike Rollins was a masterpiece of forensic metallurgy. It detailed the exact chemical composition of the tungsten-carbide shard and the microscopic traces of specialized horological lubricant. Detective Inspector Harold Miller had his smoking gun. He cross-referenced local trade registries and narrowed the suspects to 7 precision machinists in the Don Valley area. Alistair Vance Glowich was 4th on that list, but Miller fundamentally misunderstood the very system he worked for. He assumed the constabulary was a functional machine. In reality, the South Yorkshire CID in 1979 was heavily compromised by the same systemic friction Vance Glowich despised. Rollins, before his extraction, had been a highly lucrative informant and financial conduit for several senior officers. He had been paying off the local bent coppers for years to keep his loan-sharking operation insulated from vice raids. When Miller placed his findings on the desk of his detective chief superintendent, expecting authorization for a wave of dawn raids, he was met with a wall of bureaucratic silence. The DCS recognized the horological oil, not as a clue to a master machinist, but as a potential link to a fencing operation involving stolen luxury timepieces that a few of his own sergeants were quietly running out of a lockup in Rotherham. A thorough investigation into specialized mechanics would inevitably shine a spotlight on their own illicit supply chains. The instruction came down from the top. The Rollins case was to be permanently stalled. The tungsten shard was misfiled in the basement archives of the central station. The list of 7 names was shredded. Miller, suffering from an acute ulcer and the crushing realization of his department's corruption, was forced into early medical retirement. The old bill had effectively swallowed its own tail. Sitting in his cellar on Carbrook Street, Vance Glowich monitored the sudden death of the investigation with clinical detachment. He had spent weeks preparing for a police raid, meticulously cleaning his lathe and burying the modified pneumatic tool beneath the floorboards. When the knock at the door never came, he did not feel relief. He felt a profound intellectual disgust. The societal engine was so degraded that it would actively sabotage its own diagnostic mechanisms to protect the rot. This realization required a fundamental shift in his methodology. The pneumatic bolt, while efficient, left a physical signature. It was an instrument of the 1970s, a brutal, heavy industry solution. As the decade turned and the economic landscape of Sheffield shifted toward mass privatization, the targets were changing. They no longer operated exclusively out of smoky betting shops or damp council annexes. The friction was evolving into white-collar negligence. The horologist realized his maintenance schedule needed to be extended and his tools completely redesigned. He retrieved his heavy leather ledger, the spine cracking slightly in the damp cellar air. He opened a new section, documenting the transition. He required a cleaner extraction method for the 1980s, something that mimicked the increasing biological degradation of the era. Undetectable toxins, perhaps, or manipulated electrical faults that would pass unquestioned by lazy coroners. Even now, the machine required calibration. The pneumatic device was dismantled, its bespoke parts scattered across the industrial runoff of the River Don. Vance Glowach began sketching schematics for a more subtle approach, preparing his ledger for a new decade. The work was far from over. It had merely evolved. By the summer of 1981, the industrial landscape of South Yorkshire was no longer merely degrading. It was being actively dismantled. The political and economic shift toward privatization transformed Sheffield from a productive manufacturing hub into a landscape of asset stripping and corporate liquidation. The old heavy foundries were systematically closed, their machinery sold for scrap value, and their workforces permanently redundant. This transition introduced a new tier of systemic inefficiency, the corporate liquidator. These individuals did not create or maintain infrastructure. They profited exclusively from its dissolution. Geoffrey Hurst was a regional director for a prominent London-based asset realization firm. His function in Sheffield was to oversee the closure of the Neepsend investment foundry, a facility that had previously produced high-grade alloy components for marine propulsion. Hurst's operational directive was simple: maximize immediate cash extraction for shareholders by bypassing statutory environmental regulations. To avoid the substantial financial costs associated with the legal disposal of heavy industrial waste, Hurst authorized the illicit dumping of several hundred gallons of cadmium and nickel-tainted electroplating sludge directly into the disused subterranean brick culverts beneath the upper Don Valley. To Alistair Vance Glowach, observing the city from his cellar on Carbrook Street, Hurst's actions represented a catastrophic escalation of friction. The previous targets had been localized anomalies, corrupt individuals acting within an established framework. Hurst was a symptom of a broader, macroeconomic rot that actively ruined the physical geography of the region for short-term financial metrics. The introduction of toxic heavy metals into the local water table was an irreversible disruption of the regional machine. The extraction required an entirely new methodology. The pneumatic bolt tool was obsolete. Its physical signature was too specific, and the police corruption exposed during the Rollins investigation demonstrated that traditional violence simply fed into the corrupt loop of the local CID. The 1980s demanded a bloodless administrative solution that left no forensic trace for the old bill to misfile. The Horologist decided to utilize Hurst's own corporate environment against him. Hurst maintained a temporary administrative office on the first floor of a semi-abandoned brick warehouse adjacent to the Neepsend site. The building was damp, poorly insulated, and heated by an outdated, commercial-grade town gas space heater mounted to the internal brickwork. Over a weekend in late November, Vance Glowach bypassed the building's primitive perimeter padlock using a set of custom-milled tension picks. The modification of the heating unit was executed with horological precision. The fuel bypass. Using a micro-drill mounted to a portable hand brace, Vance Glowach bored a 0.08 mm aperture through the primary brass diaphragm valve of the heater, ensuring a minute but continuous flow of uncombusted gas even when the unit was set to its lowest operational threshold. The safety override. The thermal safety thermocouple, designed to automatically shut off the main gas line if the pilot light failed, was permanently immobilized. Vance Glowach applied a minute bead of high melting point silver solder to the mechanical linkage, locking the internal valve into a permanent open position. Ventilation sabotage. The external flue, which exhausted carbon monoxide through the brick wall into the alleyway, was quietly obstructed from the outside using a dense plug of industrial wire wool and quick-setting dark mortar. The trap was entirely passive. On Tuesday evening, Hurst remained late in his office to finalize the liquidation ledger for the Neepsend foundry. The ambient temperature dropped below freezing, prompting him to activate the wall heater at full capacity. As the room temperature stabilized, the obstructed flue prevented the exhaust gases from escaping, causing a rapid accumulation of carbon monoxide within the tightly sealed, draft-excluded office. Because the gas was completely colorless and odorless, Hurst experienced no physical alarm. The hypoxic environment induced rapid cognitive degradation, followed by a total loss of consciousness within 20 minutes. The modified brass valve ensured that even after Hearst collapsed and the oxygen levels dropped to the point of extinguishing the open flame, the gas line continued to silently bleed toxins into the room. When a junior clerk unlocked the office at 8 o'clock the following morning, Hearst was found dead at his desk, his skin displaying the classic, vivid, cherry-red discoloration characteristic of severe carbon monoxide poisoning.
We will adjourn until Tuesday.
The subsequent investigation by the health and safety executive was brief and entirely predictable. The economic climate of 1981 provided a ready-made narrative of urban decay and neglected maintenance. The coroner's report concluded that the fatality was the direct result of an unserviced, obsolete appliance failing in a condemned building, a tragic but common consequence of the era's industrial decline. The file was closed as an accidental death due to corporate misadventure. Vance Glowacz returned to Carbrook Street. He opened his heavy leather ledger, drew a clean line through Jeffrey Hearst's name, and began calculating the operational tolerances of the next corporate entity on his list. The mechanism had been updated, the friction removed, and the city remained completely oblivious to the hand that was turning the key. By March 1984, South Yorkshire had descended into a state of open, localized warfare. The miners' strike fractured the county into hostile territories. The constant clashes between massed pickets and imported militarized police units at the Orgreave coking plant generated an unprecedented level of systemic noise. To the general public, it was a political crisis. To Alistair Vance Glowacz, it was a deafening, inefficient grinding of gears. He possessed no ideological sympathy for the National Union of Mine Workers, nor did he support the Conservative government's strategy of industrial attrition. Both sides were merely blunt instruments trapped in a destructive feedback loop. However, the chaos provided excellent operational cover. The local constabulary was completely overwhelmed, their resources drained by 24-hour riot control and logistics management. Routine investigations were effectively abandoned. The friction Vance Glowacz identified during this period was not found on the picket lines, but within the legal apparatus attempting to process the fallout. Arthur Penhaligon was a stipendiary magistrate presiding over the emergency court set up to fast-track the prosecution of striking miners. Outwardly, Penhaligon was a pillar of the local judiciary, delivering harsh, summary justice to clear the heavily backlogged dockets. The reality of his operation was significantly more pragmatic. Through a series of blind trusts, Penhaligon was a major shareholder in 3 private haulage firms contracted by the National Coal Board to move scab coal across the county borders at highly inflated emergency rates. By aggressively remanding local strike leaders into custody, he was effectively clearing the motorways for his own fleet. He was utilizing the judicial system as a personal revenue generator, deeply unbalancing the local economic mechanics. Penhaligon resided in a gated, detached property in the affluent suburb of Dore, heavily insulated from the industrial violence he was profiting from. He drove a 1983 Jaguar XJ6, a vehicle notorious within engineering circles for its overcomplicated and unreliable hydraulic systems. To the horologist, the vehicle presented a perfectly calibrated vulnerability. The extraction was entirely chemical and required no direct confrontation. On a Tuesday night in late April, while Penhaligon slept, Vance Glowacz bypassed the property's rudimentary perimeter alarms. He slid beneath the chassis of the parked Jaguar, armed only with a specialized extraction syringe and a custom-milled replacement component. The mechanism of failure was designed around the vehicle's brake master cylinder. Vance Glowacz carefully drained a minimal amount of the hydraulic brake fluid, just enough to access the primary pressure seal. He removed the factory-standard ethylene propylene DNA monomer, EPDM rubber O-ring, and replaced it with an identical ring he had cast in his cellar. The replacement seal was dimensionally perfect, accurate to within 1/1000th of an inch. However, it was cast from a synthetic polyurethane blend that was highly reactive to standard DOT4 brake fluid. The system was fully bled and resealed within 12 minutes. There was no immediate effect. The polyurethane ring maintained its structural integrity, allowing the braking system to function normally. However, the chemical reaction initiated a slow, exponential degradation of the polymer. The horologist had calculated the decay rate based on the fluid's acidity and the average hydraulic pressure generated by Penhaligon's daily commute. The seal was designed to fail in precisely 18 days. On the 17th of May, Penhaligon was driving back to Sheffield from a regional magistrate's dinner in Manchester. His route took him over the Snake Pass, a winding, notoriously steep stretch of tarmac that cuts through the Pennines. As the Jaguar approached the sharp descent toward the Ladybower Reservoir, Penhaligon applied the brakes to navigate a hairpin turn. The degraded polyurethane seal, having lost 90% of its tensile strength over the preceding 2.5 weeks, ruptured instantly under the hydraulic pressure. The brake fluid blew past the primary and secondary chambers, resulting in a total and immediate loss of braking power. The heavy luxury sedan left the carriageway at 65 miles per hour, dropping 80 feet down a heavily wooded embankment before colliding with a sheer limestone outcrop. Penhaligon suffered massive, fatal deceleration trauma. The subsequent inquest was heavily brief. The vehicle inspectors found the ruptured seal, but the chemical degradation was completely indistinguishable from standard mechanical failure exacerbated by the extreme heat of the subsequent engine fire. British Leyland's reputation for poor manufacturing quality control provided a convenient and unassailable narrative. The coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death due to catastrophic mechanical failure. In his cellar on Carbrook Street, Vance Glowatz logged the extraction in his ledger under a new column designated for administrative oversight. The methodology had been perfected. The city's corrupt architecture was now being systematically dismantled, using its own structural flaws. By 1989, the transformation of Sheffield's economic topography was nearly complete. The soot-stained brickwork of the Don Valley was being systematically cleared to make way for the consumer infrastructure of the next decade. The primary symbol of this shift was the construction of massive retail complexes on the graves of the former steelworks. The old economy of production had been replaced by an economy of circulation, bringing with it a highly sophisticated white-collar variant of systemic friction. Bernard Finch was a principal site safety consultant contracted to oversee the structural validation of the massive retail developments in the Don Valley. Finch was highly qualified, deeply cynical, and entirely corrupt. To meet aggressive corporate completion deadlines and secure substantial performance bonuses, Finch implemented a standardized system of falsifying non-destructive testing, NDT reports for the structural steel frameworks. Substandard, imported girders displaying significant internal microvoids were routinely certified as load-bearing structures. To Alistair Vance Glowatz, Finch was a dangerous variable, a man introducing latent structural instability into the very foundations of the new city. The horologist viewed Finch's fraudulent certifications as a form of mechanical hysteresis, a delayed, inevitable failure stored within the material itself, waiting for a specific threshold of stress to trigger a collapse. The extraction was scheduled for a rainy Thursday evening in November 1989. Finch maintained a temporary field office on the upper level of an active construction sector, accessible only via a heavy-duty rack and pinion materials hoist mounted to the exterior scaffolding. The hoist was a robust, West German-engineered unit designed to transport both personnel and heavy payloads. Vance Glowatz utilized a non-destructive mechanical intervention that left no physical trace of human tampering. Over the preceding weekend, disguised in standard high-visibility sight gear, the horologist gained access to the hoist's primary mechanical overspeed governor, the critical safety brake designed to lock the cage to the vertical rail if the descent speed exceeded safe parameters. The modification was executed with clinical precision. The governor bias. The governor operated on a centrifugal flyweight mechanism. Vance Glowatz did not damage the weights. Instead, he used a micro-applicator to introduce a high-viscosity synthetic dampening gel into the pivot bearings of the flyweights. This gel, engineered to maintain its density at low temperatures, artificially increased the mechanical resistance within the governor. The threshold shift. The modification did not disable the brake. It merely shifted its activation threshold. The hoist would operate normally under standard operational speeds, but the governor would fail to deploy during a sudden, rapid acceleration until the velocity reached a catastrophic terminal limit. The primary drive intervention. Vance Glowax then applied a precise, highly localized application of a chemical surfactant to the primary hydraulic drive seals of the hoist's motor, initiating a slow, predictable degradation of the fluid pressure under heavy loads. On the night of the extraction, Finch entered the hoist alone at 2100, carrying a briefcase filled with falsified structural logs. As the lift began its descent from the fourth-tier platform, the degraded hydraulic seals failed under the combined weight of the heavy cage and the wet weather conditions. The pressure dropped instantly, causing the hoist to enter a state of freefall. Due to the synthetic gel in the centrifugal governor, the safety flyweights failed to deploy at the designated safety margin. The mechanism remained dormant as the velocity accelerated exponentially. By the time the centrifugal force finally overcame the viscous resistance of the gel, the hoist was a mere 15 feet from the concrete foundation pad. The safety brakes engaged at terminal velocity, stripping the teeth from the vertical rack and shearing the mounting brackets. The cage slammed into the reinforced concrete base at 40 miles per hour. Finch died instantly from massive internal hemorrhaging and a fractured cervical spine. The briefcase ruptured on impact, scattering the fraudulent NDT logs across the muddy floor of the construction site. The subsequent investigation by the factory inspectorate was clinical and short-lived. The construction boom of the late 1980s was notorious for rushed logistics and mechanical neglect. The forensic engineers identified the hydraulic seal failure and noted the stripped teeth on the safety rack, attributing the disaster to a classic cascade failure brought on by poor maintenance and severe weather. The synthetic gel, completely emulsified and washed away by the high-pressure hydraulic fluid that coated the wreckage during the impact, was entirely missed by the inspectors. The verdict was recorded as accidental death due to industrial mechanical failure. Vance Glowatz returned to his cellar on Carbrook Street. The air was colder now, the surrounding neighborhood increasingly quiet as the old terrace houses were slowly abandoned. He opened his heavy leather ledger, flipped past the entries from the 1970s, and drew a clean, unhurried line through Bernard Finch's name. The ledger contained only one remaining blank page before the final index. The calibration of Sheffield was reaching its terminal sequence. By January 1991, the mechanical architecture of Sheffield had been completely overwritten. The physical gears of industry, the rolling mills, the drop forges, the heavy lathes, had been replaced by the silent, invisible logic of microprocessors and digital finance. The Meadowhall retail complex now sprawled over the footprint of the old East Hecla steelworks, a monument to the new economy of imported goods and credit deficits. To Alistair Vance Glowatz, the city was no longer a machine he could calibrate. The friction was no longer physical, it was administrative, encoded in banking mainframes and offshore ledgers. He was a master of brass, high-carbon steel, and pneumatics. He recognized with cold, unsentimental clarity that he was becoming an obsolete component. However, the heavy leather ledger sitting on his workbench contained one final blank page. There was a single, outstanding structural error that required correction to close the localized loop. Martin Gable was the former detective chief superintendent of the South Yorkshire Constabulary who, in 1979, had deliberately buried the forensic metallurgy report connecting the Horologist to the Terence or Rollins extraction. Gable had not done this out of incompetence, but to protect a lucrative fencing operation run by his own bent coppers. Now in his late 60s, Gable had retired on a heavily inflated municipal pension, living comfortably in a detached Victorian property in the affluent sector of Ranmore. To the public, he was a decorated public servant. In the ledger, he was the original systemic anomaly, the central gear that had actively protected the rot. Gable suffered from severe, late-stage emphysema, a byproduct of 40 years of chain-smoking unfiltered cigarettes in poorly ventilated incident rooms. He was entirely dependent on an early-generation heavy-duty medical oxygen concentrator while he slept. The machine, a bulky unit that sat beside his bed, utilized twin cylinders filled with a zeolite mineral to scrub nitrogen from the ambient air, delivering highly purified oxygen through a nasal cannula. To Vance Glowacz, the machine was a rudimentary, poorly secured compressor. The extraction was scheduled for a freezing Monday night in early February. Gable's property was secured by a modern electronic alarm system, but the external exhaust vent for the oxygen concentrator was routed directly through a retrofitted hole in the ground floor brickwork. Vance Glowacz did not need to enter the residence. Standing in the dark, frost-covered garden, shielded by a heavy laurel hedge, he performed his final act of localized calibration. The methodology was purely pneumatic and entirely undetectable. The sieve reversal. Using a customized high-torque micro-borer, Vance Glowacz accessed the external exhaust manifold. He did not destroy the machine. He simply inverted its mechanical function. By carefully redirecting the exhaust pressure valve and blocking the primary intake with a fitted airtight polymer seal, he forced the compressor to draw its air supply backward through the waste port, the nitrogen bleed. The zeolite mineral beds, designed to trap nitrogen and release oxygen, were instantly overwhelmed by the reversed pressure gradient. The machine ceased delivering concentrated oxygen and began pumping the highly concentrated, scrubbed nitrogen directly into Gable's cannula. Within the bedroom, the steady mechanical hum of the compressor never altered its pitch. Gable, asleep under heavy blankets, experienced no physical distress. The delivery of pure nitrogen is entirely painless. It does not trigger the hypercapnic alarm response in the human brain that carbon dioxide buildup does. The former policeman simply drifted into a deeper state of hypoxia, his cognitive functions smoothly shutting in before his heart finally ceased beating at 3:14 a.m. The following morning, Gable's home care nurse found him unresponsive. The subsequent medical examination was a bureaucratic formality. Given Gable's extensive medical history and severely degraded lung capacity, the attending physician recorded the cause of death as respiratory failure secondary to end-stage emphysema. The oxygen concentrator, functioning normally once the polymer seal was quietly retrieved by Vance Glowacz before dawn, was returned to the local health authority without a second glance. The old bill did not launch an investigation. They simply sent a floral arrangement to the funeral. In the cellar on Carbrook Street, Alistair Vance Glowacz sat beneath the harsh utility bulb for the last time. He opened the heavy leather ledger, documented the final nitrogen extraction in neat block capitals, and drew a definitive line through Martin Gable's name. The ledger was full. He did not feel a sense of vindication or moral triumph. He had merely executed a long-term maintenance schedule. He methodically dismantled his heavy metal lathe, coating the individual steel components in thick industrial grease before wrapping them in oilcloth. He poured bleach over his workbench to dissolve any remaining traces of horological lubricants. Finally, he placed the completed ledger into a heavy iron strongbox, locked it, and buried it deep within the damp, brick-lined crawlspace beneath the foundations of the house. By the end of the week, 42 Carbrook Street was empty. Alistair Vance Glowacz walked away from the Don Valley, stepping quietly into the endless, uncalibrated friction of the new decade, leaving no trace behind but the silence of a city that had fundamentally forgotten how its own gears turned.